Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing a Little Birdie thank you card. This is part of an Instagram hop where we're doing some cards for our community, first responders, that sort of thing. So I didn't have one that was specifically matched for that. So I decided to use this Birds of a Feather stamp set along with this My Best Friend stamp set. And really, I'm only using it for the word thanks in that sentiment. And I'm going to create a thank you card with a little bit of a different theme. I wanted my pieces to have a little bit of a mixed media-ish feel to them. I'm using some mixed media Heavystock, and I'm going to create some distressed backgrounds and then do some fussy cutting with some paper piecing so we have a lot of texture to this card. So for my first background, I'm using two different distress pads as well as an interference pad. I'm using Tumbled Glass and Uncharted Mariner, and then I'm pulling in some Opal blush interference. Now I'm putting my distress inks on the Tim Holtz media mat first, then I'm putting the Opal blush interference ink. That way I'm not contaminating any of my pads. Then I use a Mighty Mister to spray water on that surface, and then I can dip that mixed media Heavystock into those inks. Now I'm going to dip them in the inks, and then I'm going to use a heated tool to dry off the ink. It doesn't need to be 100% dry, like even 80-90% dry is good, and then we can dip it back in more. If I were to dip this back into the ink while it's still wet, it's just going to blend all those ink together. By drying each and every layer, I get a lot more texture and I get a lot more layers with it. So it creates a really fun look that's going to get a unique background. If this ends up being a bit too busy for you, you could always use solid cardstock and do some ink blending so you have a little bit more control over it. But I really like the look this gives as well as the little bit of texture. Now I do this for, this here is going to be my background to go behind the birds, and then I do another one in browns so that I have something to do the birds with. So both the background as well as the birds have a lot of texture to them. And again, if you want to tone it down a little bit more, you can either do a little bit less layers with this background, or you could use a solid piece of cardstock with the background and just use the mixed media paper for the birds to just have the birds have that texture to them. It's entirely up to you. When you're creating, you can pick and choose exactly what parts are good for you and what parts are just a little bit too much. So I am going to keep dipping this into the ink on my desk, and I'm going to use my heated tool to dry it. Now a heated tool emits heat. It's good for drying mixed media things in the store, things like that. It's like an embossing tool, but it's a lot gentler. You could use this for embossing, but it takes a little bit longer than using embossing tool because an embossing tool really directs that heat, whereas this just kind of emits heat and helps to dry things. So it's good for drying different mediums. Perfect for this background here. Now I mentioned that I'm working on a Tim Holtz media surface mat. That helps the ink to just stay in those little bits on there. It doesn't, if you were to work on say a glass mat, it most likely would create one big pool. You wouldn't have all those little bits of ink. So it definitely helps to work on the mixed media mat for creating this background. It's a great surface for doing it, and you get all those little bubbles and little bits of dots of texture. So this background here, you can do as much or as little as you want. You could do 1 or 2 layers, or you could go and just keep adding more layers to it. If as you're doing it, you find that it's just a little bit too much texture or too many layers, what you can do is you can mist your background with water, rehydrate it, and that's going to soften everything a little bit. Once I get it to the point where I like it, I set that over to the side, and then I clean off my mat before starting to work on my brown background here. So for my browns here, I'm using tea dye, vintage photo, and then the interference ink I'm pulling in with this one is Royal Truffle. So if you've never used interference inks before, I like to call them magic pads because they have almost 2 different colors to them. They have a color that shows up on white or light cardstock and a separate color that shows up on black or dark cardstock. And when you work on the light cardstock, if you tilt it into the light, you can see that interference, that shine that shows up on the black. So it's just a really different ink to work with. I have a whole playlist on with projects where I'm using it. For this particular use, I'm using it for the brown color because we're working on light color or light cardstock, but you're going to see the little bit of that interference blue on different areas of this background. It's really, really subtle. I don't think it really shows up well on the video, but when you tilt that cardstock in the light, there's some areas that have little pockets of that blue shimmer to them. And it's really, really beautiful. For the Opal blush that I used with the blues, that one has a bit of a pink shimmer to them. So on that background, there's a few different areas where you just get a little tiny bit of a pink shimmer to them. It just adds something a little bit more interesting and a little bit less flat than just doing plain distress inks. Another option for this would be to use, say, a shimmer spray with it. If you didn't have an interference pad, you could use a shimmer spray with it. Obviously, the look is going to be just a little bit different. You could also use some Perfect Pearls. That's a mica powder that has a binding agent in it that is activated with water. That is another way to get that little bit of that look in there too. But I really love this, and I really love that that little interference bit is a contrasting color or a different color from the browns or from the blues in the blue background. So you can see a little bit of that blue shimmer, and like I said, it's really subtle. It's not in your face, but it's a really fun way to add something a little bit interesting to that background. So I haven't used this Birds of a Feather stamp set before. So the very first thing I'm going to do is use a white eraser on top of the stamping surface. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue that might be on there, and it just helps the ink or the stamp take ink a little bit better. When I go to use this distress background here, I am placing my stamps for the look, for the color, for the texture that is on that background. I'm not placing them to make the most use of this background. Any of the extra bits I can save for future projects, but I really like the texture in that bottom right corner where I'm putting that larger bird, and then the line where I'm putting the line of birds. There's one little bit that has some speckles of that interference color, of that little bit of blue. So I'm positioning that to be on the belly of one of the birds, just to make use of that, as well as the fact that I like the rest of the texture that the other birds are getting. So I'm going to heat emboss on this, and then I'm going to fussy cut these birds out. Now I did mess up with my filming, and I didn't actually film the fussy cutting of the birds. I thought I was recording, and then once I was done fussy cutting them, realized that I hadn't recorded it. It's just cutting them out with a pair of scissors that is nice and sharp, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I want to heat emboss these images on this background. So I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on my background to make sure everything was completely dry. Then I stamped it with some VersaMark ink, and I'm heat embossing it with some Scorched Timber Distress glaze. This is a nice dark brown. I thought it would coordinate nicely with that mixed media background and not be too stark. You could also use black here because the Scorched Timber really is not much different than black, but I like that it has that black tone. And the Distress Glaze comes in so many different colors, so it's a great alternative to some of like doing it in black or doing it something that is going to have a lot more contrast to it. So off screen, when I messed up my recording, I did my fussy cutting of those birds, and I actually did a little bit of inking as well. I wanted there to be colored bellies and colored tails on these birds, but I wanted them to be a little bit more interesting than just plain ink. So I am using interference inks for that. I'm choosing them based on the color that shows up on lighter cardstock. So I used Opal blush for the blue belly, pink champagne for the pink bellies, and then lavender fields for the little purple bellies, and then obviously the tails as well. So this just adds a little bit more visual texture to it. You could use plain distress ink, but that interference ink has that little bit of shimmer to it. It gives it that little bit of something for the light to catch when you tilt the card. Now, I want my background of this card, or my card base, to be a little bit more interesting than just a plain A2 card. It is still going to be A2 size, but I'm using a die set, a nesting die set from my stash. This one is Scalloped Labels and Tags, and I'm going to create a shaped card base for it. Anytime I want to change up my card a little bit, give it something a little bit more interesting than just a plain rectangle background, this is usually what I go to because it's so easy to create a shaped card, but it adds a lot of interest. So I chose the three largest sizes from this die set. The largest one I'm using to create the base. I have some white cardstock here that I'm cutting 2 pieces of for my card base. The next size down, I'm going to be creating a mat for behind my sky, and I'm using some Truffle cardstock for that. It's just going to be a little bit smaller than my card background or my card base, and it's just going to tie in with the browns of the bird as well as that Scorched Timber Distress glaze. Just give it something to frame it right in. You could also do a third mixed media background with that browns and use that as your mat as well. I decided that just solid cardstock would be a little bit better for the look that I was going for. The third size down, I'm using it on my blue mixed media distress background here, and I cut all of those sizes, have them ready to go. For my card base, I'm using my Score Pal, and I'm scoring up the 4.5 inch mark, making sure that I have a nice hinge on that piece to create my card base. And then I add a little bit of glue to the part above that score line. I'm using some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so it is perfect for putting small die cuts together as well as assembling cards. Once I have that glue on there, I stick those two together, making sure that everything is lined up perfectly. Then I can put my brown mat on the top of that, and then I'll put my acrylic block on there, set it aside to dry. That acrylic block just holds everything nice and flat, makes sure that nothing starts to warp from that liquid glue. It also frees up my hands for working with other things. Now I want to put these birds on the background, but when I did my fussy cutting, I lost the line that those birds were, or the wire that those birds were sitting on. So I want to add that back in. So I take that bird stamp and I put it where I want on that card background. I'm using my Misti stamping tool for this, as well as my other stamping, because this way I can stamp it multiple times and make sure that I have a crisp, clean image of that impression. I'm doing the same embossing that I did for my birds in the first place. So I put that embossing powder tool on there, stamped it with some VersaMark ink, and then I'm going to pour that Scorched Timber Distress glaze on top of that and use my heat tool to melt it. Now earlier when I was using my Heat It tool for the mixed media background, I mentioned that you can emboss with it, and I could use it to emboss with this, but like I said, it takes a little bit longer for that embossing, and because I already have another embossing tool, this is going to work a lot quicker. It directs the heat just a little bit better. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to add some sentiments to my card. So I want the inside of the card, or the outside of the card is going to say "A Little Birdie Told Me," because I thought it would work well with those birds. And then the inside, the first sentiment is going to say you are so tweet. And then I'm going to use the thanks from that My Best Friends stamp set. So this is also where that Misti stamping tool really comes in handy. So I can stamp that sentiment multiple times, making sure that I have a nice crisp image, and I know that it's going to stamp in exactly the same place. So I do that first sentiment first. Then when I get the second sentiment there, I line it up with the word thanks, because that's the only word from that sentiment that I want to use. Now you could, if you wanted to, use some tape or post-it notes to mask the rest of the sentiment off. I have distress pads here that I'm using to stamp this sentiment, and that word is right in the corner of that sentiment, so it's pretty easy to look on the side while I'm inking and make sure that I'm only inking that one word there. And just like that first sentiment, I'm going to stamp it multiple times until I have the darkness of that ink that I want. And I just used that vintage photo distress ink that I was using for my mixed media background, so it coordinates nicely with the browns on my birds on the front as well. Once I have that sentiment done, I can work on the sentiment for my card front. I want to heat emboss this on there just like I heat emboss the birds. It's just going to give it a little bit more visual impact. It's going to give it that raised glossy look because of the distress glaze. If this were a solid stamp, the distress glaze is actually transparent. It's colored, but it's transparent. So you could still see the texture from the mixed media background on there if you chose to use something that was larger and solid. For this, because the lines for my bird as well as the lines for that sentiment are pretty tiny, you don't really see it. I think if you had, or if it was a lighter color, you might be able to see the texture a little bit more, but I wanted it to be dark. I wanted it to show up well on that blue background. Once I have it stamped and poured that powder on there, there was a few particles of that distress glaze sticking to other areas of that part of the card. So I just used a soft brush in order to clean that up before using my embossing tool to melt that powder. Now we're ready to add this piece to the front of the card. So I'm using that Barely Art glue again, going around the outside edges. You can see some of that distress background that showed up on the back from when I was drying it. I always love looking at the backs of these because some of the backs create or come up with some really interesting patterns and textures and colors too. So once I have this on here, I'm ready to start gluing down my birds. Now I'm going to glue them down right on top of the embossed images that are on the background to that card. So I know exactly where everything is going to go because of the lines on that stamped image. And because my birds are a contrasting color from the blue of the background, they pop off the page just a little bit more. Now, like I said earlier, if you want, you could could create a more subtle background by just misting that with water before you die cut it and let it completely dry, just to mute those colors, blend them a little bit more. Another option would be to layer a little bit, like put some vellum on top of there before doing the birds on the front. For the bird beaks, I just used a Tombow marker. This was 933, just to give it a bit of an orange tone to it, and then added a dot of glossy accents on those beaks. That way they have some dimension and shine to them as well. I always love doing mixed media projects and adding a little bit of extra texture to things. So we have a lot of visual texture here from that distress background. Then we have the interference colors here. Now I wanted to add just a touch more texture, so I'm using some Stardust stickles on the tails of the birds, not covering the tails completely, just adding a few lines here and there. This doesn't have any color to it. It's an opalescent or iridescent finish. So the color of the ink underneath shines through. It just adds some sparkle and it adds a little bit of texture. And sometimes just a bit of sparkle and texture is what you need to finish things off. So here is the finished card. We have the line of the birds in the front, the large one on the bottom, and then the sentiment that says, "A little birdie told me." And then on the inside, it says, "You're so tweet, thanks." I keep struggling or stumbling on those words, but just a different way to create a thank you card and create something that has a bit of a bird theme to them. Perfect for bird lovers or really anyone. And I love sentiments that are punny, and I love that there are sentiments in that set as well. You'll find everything I used listed and linked down in the description box below. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button before you leave. I appreciate all the time that you spend with me. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.